Power in Africa often comes in liberation, development, and sovereignty. But once the speeches end and the campaign dust settles, many citizens are left grappling with the harsh reality. Rising food prices, lack of jobs, vanishing freedoms, decaying institutions, and leaders who just won't let go. Across the continent, some presidents have become known for their authoritarianism, dynastic politics, and economic decline of their country, turning public respect into resentment and hate. Here are the 10 most hated presidents in Africa. At number 10, we have President Abdel Fattah ElSissi of Egypt. Rising from the ranks of the military, ElSissi seized power. In 2013, he orchestrated the ousting of Egypt's first democratically elected president, Mohamed Morsi, amid a turbulent wave of protests. To some, this was a rescue mission from Islamist rule. To others, it was the death knell of the revolution they had so recently fought for in Tahrir Square. ElSissi officially became president in 2014 and has clung tightly to the reins ever since, thanks to carefully choreographed elections in 2018 and again in 2023. Now, 11 years into his rule, constitutional tweaks have cleared the path for him to remain in power until at least 2030. But the Egypt he governs today is not the Egypt many hoped for post-Arab Spring, and he is hated for that. He promised stability and, to an extent, delivered it. But Egypt today is suffocating under a regime where dissent is not just discouraged, it's dangerous. Thousands have been jailed, including journalists, human rights activists, students, and even social media users accused of spreading false news or belonging to outlawed groups. Human Rights Watch paints a grim picture of a nation where torture, secret prisons, and enforced disappearances are routine tools of governance. ElSissi's supporters like to point to mega projects, the new administrative capital rising in the desert, and the expanded Suez Canal as signs of progress. But for the average Egyptian, these glittering ventures feel like distant illusions. Inflation is rampant, the local currency has been devalued repeatedly, and the gap between rich and poor has grown cavernous. Over 30% of the population now lives below the poverty line. Next up at number 9, we have Mahamat Dembele of Chad. Dembele stepped into power with the weight of legacy across his shoulders, and the people's mistrust was already growing. The son of longtime ruler Idris Deby, Mahamat assumed the presidency not through an election, but through a military transition in 2021 after his father was killed in battle. Let's just say he is not the most liked person in Chad. At just 37 when he took over, Mahamat promised a swift return to civilian rule and free elections. Instead, he delayed them, clung to his unelected status for 3 years, and eventually ran and conveniently won the 2024 election with 61% of the vote. Opposition figures were arrested, driven into exile, or simply disappeared. The people weren't fooled. They saw a dynasty in disguise. The protests came hard and fast, particularly in October 2022, but so did the crackdown. Dozens of demonstrators were killed by security forces, a brutal reminder that the Deby name still held the same iron-fisted reputation it had for decades. Human Rights Watch has since documented ongoing repression, arbitrary arrests, and media censorship under Mahamat's watch. Economically, Chad continues to be one of the most impoverished nations on Earth. Despite its oil wealth, most citizens live without access to clean water, electricity, or adequate health care. Roads crumble, hospitals go without supplies, and schools function in name only. The government rakes in petrodollars, but for the Deby family's elite circle, and certainly not the millions scraping by on less than $2 a day. Even security, Mahamat's supposed area of expertise, is a disaster. Boko Haram continues to torment the Lake Chad region, and instability from neighboring Sudan spills across the borders. Despite being a general himself, Mahamat has failed to make Chadians feel safe. The army is well funded, but the streets tell a different story. At number 8, we have President Yoweri Museveni of Uganda. When he took over Uganda in 1986, he was a 42-year-old revolutionary with promises of democracy, stability, and an end to the tyranny that had plagued the country under Idi Amin and Milton Obote. Fast forward to 2025, and Museveni, now 80 years of age, is still clinging to the presidential chair, 39 years and counting. Museveni didn't just overstay his welcome, he rewrote the rules so he could stay. In 2005, he abolished term limits. In 2017, he removed age limits too. With every constitutional tweak, his grip tightened. Elections in Uganda have become predictable and staged contests where opposition candidates are harassed, arrested, or violently suppressed. The 2021 election saw his most vocal rival, Bobi Wine, repeatedly jailed, his supporters beaten, and the internet shut down nationwide. Uganda's press is heavily censored, and state security forces routinely crack down on protests. Despite boasting consistent GDP growth, the economic picture for ordinary Ugandans is bleak. Youth unemployment is sky-high, over 60%. Corruption seeps into every corner of governance. Museveni's legacy looks less like that of a liberator and more like a long-reigning autocrat. At number 7, we have President Paul Biya of Cameroon. At 91 years old, Paul Biya is the world's oldest head of state, and perhaps more astonishingly, still in office. Since November 6, 1982, he has ruled Cameroon with a blend of quiet cunning and heavy-handed control. That's 43 years of power, making him one of the longest-serving leaders not just in Africa, but in global history. For many Cameroonians, Biya's rule is less a presidency and more a geological era. Initially seen as a calm successor to Amadou Ahidjo, Biya soon revealed a talent for political survival. In 2008, he abolished term limits. Elections under his watch have been all about vote rigging, low turnout, and suppression of opposition voices. Biya rarely speaks, rarely travels within Cameroon, and yet his grip is iron-tight. He spends large amounts of time in Switzerland and France, leading to the nickname the absentee president. But what truly made Biya hated is the Anglophone crisis. Since 2016, Cameroon's English-speaking regions have erupted in violence, protesting decades of marginalization by the Francophone-dominated government. Biya's response has been brutal. Thousands have died, and over 700,000 people have been displaced. Schools have been torched, civilians killed, and human rights groups blocked from investigating abuses. Meanwhile, Cameroon's infrastructure rots. Hospitals are understaffed, roads are decaying, and civil servants go unpaid for months. Despite this, Biya is worth around $200 million, owning over 20 luxury properties in France. For millions, Paul Biya represents everything wrong with African strongmen: longevity without legacy, silence in the face of suffering, and a lavish life bankrolled by a broken state. At number 6, we have President Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbasogo. This is a man who's basically redefined dictatorship in Africa. Ruling Equatorial Guinea since 1979, Obiang isn't just the longest-serving president in Africa, he's the longest-ruling non-royal leader in the world. 46 years in power, and counting. That's more than most people's entire lives. But longevity doesn't always mean legacy. In Obiang's case, it means decay, repression, and a nation suffocated under one man's grip. Equatorial Guinea is a small country with big oil wealth tucked away in Central Africa. But despite its riches, most of its people live in unimaginable poverty. The streets of Malabo might gleam with the shine of government buildings and the occasional luxury car, but step a few meters beyond the polished facades, and you'll see the real Equatorial Guinea: villages with no running water, hospitals without medicine, and schools that barely function. Over 70% of the population lives below the poverty line, and child mortality is among the worst in the world. Corruption, unapologetic, institutionalized, generational corruption. Obiang and his family live like global royalty. His personal net worth is estimated at over $600 million. His son, Teodorin, is known more for his obsession with yachts, Ferraris, and designer clothes than for any policy work. In fact, Teodorin has already been appointed vice president, essentially guaranteeing the family throne stays intact. He's been convicted in France for embezzling public funds, but back home, he's being groomed to take over. It's like a monarchy disguised as democracy. Obiang wins elections with 90-something% of the vote, not because people love him, but because they have no choice. There's no independent media, no real opposition, and definitely no fair elections. Torture of political prisoners is well documented, and any whiff of dissent is crushed quickly and ruthlessly. Next up at number 5, we have President Isaias Afwerki. His story could have been a tale of triumph, a freedom fighter who led Eritrea to independence after a grueling 30-year war with Ethiopia. But instead of stepping back after the hard-won victory in 1993, he tightened his grip and never let go. As of 2025, he's ruled Eritrea for 32 years. No elections, no political pluralism, no freedom, just Afwerki. Eritrea is often called the North Korea of Africa, and not without reason. It's a country sealed off from the world, where the government decides how you live, where you live, and how long you serve in the military, which, by the way, could be indefinitely. The so-called national service is essentially state-sponsored slavery, forcing young Eritreans into years, sometimes decades, of harsh military life with little to no pay. That's reality for thousands. The fear in Eritrea is tangible. There's no independent press, no opposition parties, and no freedom of religion. The prisons are full, some underground, some in desert camps, but always packed with voices that dared to speak out. Afwerki's regime has been accused by the UN of systematic, widespread, and gross human rights violations. And there's no legal recourse, because there's no real judiciary. It's one man's word or nothing. Economically, Eritrea is stuck. It has minerals like gold, copper, and zinc, but few people benefit from them. There's barely any foreign investment. International organizations have largely turned away because Afwerki refuses to open up. The country is stagnant, surviving on diaspora remittances and state control. Over 500,000 Eritreans now live abroad, not by choice, but by desperation. They risk deserts, traffickers, and the Mediterranean just to escape. Afwerki is hated not just because of the repression, but because of the betrayal. He was supposed to bring freedom, not fear. But 3 decades later, Eritreans are still waiting for the future he promised. At number 4, we have President Denis Sassou Nguesso. He is a man who's mastered the art of staying in power. He first took office in 1979, stepped down in 1992 after losing an election, then came back like a villain, this time through civil war. Since 1997, he's ruled the Republic of the Congo like it's his personal estate, manipulating laws, crushing dissent, and enriching himself while the nation crumbles. Congo-Brazzaville is an oil-rich country, but most of its people wouldn't know it. They live with blackouts, decaying infrastructure, and empty hospitals. Over 50% live in poverty, even though oil pumps non-stop. That wealth, instead of funding roads or schools, funds Sassou Nguesso's designer lifestyle. The man reportedly spent $1.3 million on shirts and suits in just 6 years. The worst part is that he keeps changing the rules to keep himself in office. In 2015, he altered the Constitution to remove term limits, effectively resetting the clock on his presidency. People protested. Security forces responded with bullets. The next election, he won, of course. Sassou Nguesso is not just hated because he's corrupt. He's hated because he refuses to leave. He's turned democracy into a game where only he holds the dice. Every time the country inches toward progress, he drags it back into stagnation, and people are tired. They're tired of broken promises, tired of being poor in a rich country, tired of watching one man and his family live large while everyone else survives on scraps. At number 3, we have President Emerson Manangagwa. When Robert Mugabe was finally ousted in 2017, Zimbabweans dared to hope. So they brought in Emerson Manangagwa, nicknamed the Crocodile, a man who had long lurked in the background of Mugabe's reign. At first, people thought he might bring change. But 8 years later, Zimbabwe is still stuck in a nightmare, just with a different face. Manangagwa promised reform. What Zimbabwe got instead was deja vu. The 2018 and 2023 elections were both filled with accusations of fraud and voter intimidation. Observers called out irregularities, but the crocodile smiled and claimed victory. In the streets, protesters who cried foul were met with bullets. In 2019, 12 people were killed during demonstrations over fuel price hikes. Economically, Zimbabwe is a mess. Inflation has turned the local currency into monopoly money, with prices changing by the hour. In 2020, inflation peaked at over 700%. Jobs are scarce, shelves are empty, and salaries can't keep up. Over 70% of Zimbabweans are unemployed or working in the informal sector. And yet, while the economy sinks, Manangagwa's inner circle swims in privilege. His rule feels like Mugabe 2.0. Same repression, same economic chaos, just a new person. People hoped for transformation. What they got was continuation. At number 2, we have President Bola Ahmed Tinubu of Nigeria, one of the most recent presidents. In 2023, Tinubu, a long-standing political titan and former governor of Lagos State, emerged as president in a hotly contested and widely criticized election. Though he won with just 36.6% of the vote, many Nigerians still question how he got into office in the first place. His presidency as of 2025 is just over 2 years old, but for many Nigerians, it feels much longer because every passing day under Tinubu has come with a new burden. His campaign slogan, Renewed Hope, now sounds like a cruel joke in marketplaces and on social media, where he is constantly mocked as the president who promised hope but delivered hardship. The economy has been one of the biggest sources of public anger. Almost immediately after taking office, Tinubu removed fuel subsidies, a move long advised by international financial bodies, but devastating to ordinary Nigerians who rely on subsidized fuel to survive. As fuel prices more than tripled, the cost of food, transportation, and basic goods shot up dramatically. Then came the decision to float the naira, Nigeria's currency, leading to rapid depreciation and worsening inflation, which officially crossed 30% in 2024. In real terms, it means Nigerians are buying less with more money and eating less with shrinking incomes. A loaf of bread now costs triple what it did in 2022. Public sector workers and pensioners have cried out, but the presidency remains unmoved. His legitimacy has also remained in question. The 2023 elections were marred by technical glitches, voter suppression, and allegations of rigging. Opposition parties called it a sham, and though the courts upheld his victory, large sections of the populace have never accepted him as their president. It doesn't help that insecurity has worsened under his watch. Boko Haram, bandits, and kidnappers continue to ravage different regions, with over 3,600 reported abductions in 2024 alone. Tinubu's online presence is no refuge either. On platforms like X, Nigerians trend hashtags mocking him daily. His speeches are remixed into satire, his pauses in public addresses mocked as signs of declining health, and every policy move dissected with scorn. And though it's only been 2 years, some Nigerians are already counting the days to 2027, praying for deliverance from what they now call the Tinubu tax on life itself. At number 1, we have President William Ruto of Kenya. The East African nation is one of Africa's most dynamic economies, often praised for its tech ecosystem and vibrant urban centers. But beneath all that lies a growing anger, especially among the youth, who feel like promises have turned to dust under President William Ruto. When he was elected in 2022, many saw him as a symbol of the common man's triumph, a poor boy turned politician who would finally make Kenya work for the ordinary citizen. His campaign message was loud and clear. The hustler nation would rise. But by 2025, that same hustler narrative has become the reason so many Kenyans feel betrayed. Ruto's win in 2022 was narrow, clinching 50.5% of the vote in a tight race. Still, he was sworn in with much hope behind him. Kenyans wanted change. They wanted fairness. They wanted food prices to fall, jobs to return, and corruption to be punished. But Ruto's tenure has so far been marked by policies that seem to punish the very people who voted for him. The most controversial of them all was the 2023 finance bill, which introduced a wave of new taxes, including on basic goods and services. The outcry was swift. Protests erupted across the country, and the government's heavy-handed response turned deadly. Tear gas, rubber bullets, and, in some cases, live ammunition were used against demonstrators. By the time the dust settled, over 40 Kenyans had lost their lives, many of them young. Videos circulated online of brutal beatings and abductions, igniting widespread fury. Human Rights Watch and other organizations condemned the crackdown. But the government stood firm, framing it as necessary for economic stability. The anger is not just about taxes, it's about trust. Ruto promised a bottom-up economic transformation, but most Kenyans say the only thing that has trickled down is pain. Then there's the growing belief that Ruto is more loyal to foreign lenders like the IMF and World Bank than to his own people. Many of his economic decisions, critics argue, seem tailored to please international financiers at the expense of local livelihoods. Loans keep piling up, and the Kenyan shilling continues to lose value. Public debt is higher than ever, and future generations will be left to pay the price.